Hello and welcome. In this lecture we're going to be talking a little bit about how one would put together a survey. Now in the health professions we use surveys pretty often, so it's quite likely that at some point in your career you'll have the opportunity to develop a survey of some sort to address some sort of health or programmatic need. Now surveys have a number of different elements to them that one would want to consider as you're developing them. And this also, in addition to understanding how to develop your own survey, it also gives you insight into how other people put together their surveys that they write about in their research papers. So as you look at what they've generated, this will give you some insight into the process that they've gone through in terms of development and what the potential strengths or challenges are of the process that they used. So generally speaking, when we're thinking about developing a research survey, we go through a process, right? So we have to start off saying, all right, what are we asking in terms of our research, all right? And what does that really mean? So how do we take those questions and turn it into, first off, understand what it means, and then figure out how we would actually ask questions where we can measure that thing that we're trying to understand or study. All right. Now, once you have a pretty good idea of how you might actually assess that research question using a survey, you might either create or identify measurement tools, survey questions that have already been created that you can then use in your survey. And you can do that through a process of writing if you want, or there's actually databases out there with validated scales of various sorts, questions of various sorts that you can pull into your study. Once you have that, you need to write your survey, and that's a process of thinking about how do you want to order the questions for your participants as they go through the survey so it makes sense to them. Once you have a survey that you're pretty happy with, then you would actually pilot test it. So you take it and do it with, ask a few people to complete it, who hopefully are fairly similar to the people that you anticipate actually doing the survey in the end. So this pilot test of the survey will give you some insight into what's working and what's not working for your survey. Then you take that information and revise it so that it's more clear and more effective based upon the feedback that you got from the pilot. And then you'd actually go and do that survey. So broadly speaking, this is often how surveys are created. Now, when you're thinking about the survey, there's some elements to consider in terms of making a high quality survey. So first is trying to be objective in terms of how you do things. We often come into research with our own opinions, and with quantitative research, survey research, it's very easy for these opinions and perspectives to be hidden, right? You want to make sure that the questions that you're asking, first off, aren't directing your participants in a certain direction, and also are asking questions that might actually disprove your own opinion about what the answer should be, right? So you want to be able to fully address the question that you're interested in. And if you do this carefully, and if you bring in other people and other people's perspectives, that will help you to minimize your biases in your generation and development of this survey. The other thing you need to think about when you're doing a survey is how to be systematic in terms of how you implement it. So asking people to complete the survey in the same way, have them do it in a similar format. All these things are things that help to minimize errors in your survey. Now, speaking of errors, you have measurement error. Measurement error is the difference between what you measure and what you're actually trying to measure, right? If you pay careful attention to the questions, spend a lot of time with them, think about them from multiple directions, and also are very careful about following your procedures, this will reduce the error that you're likely to get. There's two different types of error: systematic error, where you have something that is reliable or that tends to produce similar results, but it's just pretty far off from what you're actually trying to measure. Then you have random error, where you have certain types of surveys or questions that maybe just doesn't very accurately get to what you're trying to understand, right? So it's kind of all over the place, right? So That can happen with a range of surveys. Different types of information are going to be more or less precise depending on what types of questions you're asking and what types of things you're trying to measure. Things like psychological states tend to be much harder to measure with a great deal of accuracy than something like, a trait. Do you how old are you? Well, typically you'll probably get a pretty accurate answer to that, as compared to how are you feeling today, right? So the error, there is a certain amount of error that's inherent to studies, and you would want to think about where that error might come in. How can you create questions and surveys that minimize this as much as possible? Now, I also want to talk about operationalization of a question and proxies. So I've talked about this before, but one of the biggest challenges when you're doing a study is to take a concept, a broader concept like pain, right, and turn it into something that you can measure. The problem with pain, for example, is that pain is understood very differently by different people, and people have different thresholds and everything. So how do you actually create something that you're actually going to measure to assess that pain? You could do biophysiological measures to see if there's cortisol responses or something like that. You could do ask people to answer a survey where you look at smiley faces, right? So there's lots of different ways, but you have to go through a process of figuring out how you're going to turn a concept into something that you can actually measure. And the way that you do this, the way that you operationalize your concept, is going to be very important for the results of your study and what they actually mean for people. So think about this as you're thinking about your questions and whether or not the way you operationalize things are accurately getting at what you're interested in. I also want you to be familiar with the term of a proxy. All right, a proxy is when you're measuring something that's different than what you actually want to study. So if you're looking at socioeconomic status, for example, you might want to ask people what their yearly income was last year, right? That would be a fairly accurate measure of what people's financial situation was in terms of socioeconomic status, right? However, what we find is that a lot of people aren't very comfortable answering exactly what they made last year. They're just not comfortable giving that information to random people, right? So very often in research, what we do is you use a proxy, and we ask the question, what is your highest level of education, your highest degree of education that you received, right? And what we find is that education is a pretty good proxy for someone's income, right? The two correlate very well, and it's not perfect. So you can have people with lower education that make a lot of money and people with higher education that don't make a lot of money. But generally speaking, across an entire study, especially if a big study, it kind of averages out so that education tends to work pretty well as a proxy for income. So sometimes it's better to use education because sometimes people just won't answer if you ask about their actual income. So that's something that you should think about in terms of your study, especially if you're collecting more sensitive information. Also, some types of things are very complicated to actually ask questions about because they're complex concepts or something like that. And sometimes you can get at them easier with a proxy that's just a simpler question. All right, so let's think about a survey and how it's set up. Well, surveys are made up of lots of different questions, and there's certain types that you're going to be quite familiar with. So one might be a Likert style question. So you're probably familiar with that. So that's something where you ask a question, like how satisfied are you with your current position? One is very satisfied, ranging down to very dissatisfied, all right? So you're asking a question along a scale, and the participant gets to decide sort of where they land along that gradient that you've offered. You can also ask this in grid format, where you have a matrix where you can ask a similar type of Likert question for lots of different questions. You also have things like closed-ended questions. Closed-ended questions are where you ask a question and you sort of decided what the response categories are. So on average, how many clients do you see in one day? 1 to 3, 4 to 6. And then you have a category of 8, which is more than 20, right? Which could be, 93, right? So that's a very big category, right? So the categories here don't necessarily have an equal size, right? You can also have open-ended questions. Open-ended questions are where you ask a question and then people enter their thoughts in writing about something that they're interested in. Now, this can be analyzed using qualitative research approaches as well. So this is typically not analyzed from a quantitative perspective, but from a qualitative perspective. Although you can code these questions and turn it into a somewhat quantitative response. And we'll talk about that at a different point. So that's just talking about the different types of approaches that you can use in a survey. And there's, of course, many others as well. So when you're designing a survey, there's a few things that you consider, all right? So the formatting of the survey is really important. Having things be clear and having a clear flow so that people know everything's numbered, having space in it so it's not all packed together, not having it be clear which question you go to from another, making sure that where the responses are makes sense for the question that you're asking. So these are things that can be quite important. You also need to think about when you're designing a survey is who do you anticipate to complete that survey? If you're asking questions that have a very complex vocabulary and you're talking to a participant population that may have limited literacy, well, you're not going to get very good responses to your survey, and you might inaccurately measure what they actually think about what you're asking about, right? So you really have to think about this quite carefully in terms of the wording that you use and what types of names and terms will make sense to you, the people you're working with. When you're designing a survey, it's a good idea to start off with questions that are actually more interesting and less controversial, right? If they're more interesting, people are more likely to engage with it and get excited about completing the survey. If they're controversial, you worry that people are going to look at this few questions early on and say, oh, I don't know that I want to answer something, this is hard, or this, I don't know if I want to share this information, and they just won't respond to the survey. So generally speaking, putting that a little bit further on when people are more in the rhythm will be beneficial for people responding. If you do have these controversial, sensitive issues, they're usually good towards the middle or the end of the survey, right? That's when people tend to be more comfortable answering things. The other thing to consider is the order that you ask questions in can actually make a difference, right? So you can actually teach people things as you complete the survey, as they complete the survey. So if you're asking people about their knowledge about a health condition, and then you start asking questions, if you ask questions about their knowledge about a health condition and you ask questions with very specific information about that health condition, about different types of symptoms, and then after you ask those questions, you then ask, what types of symptoms do you know of that are related to this health condition? Well, you've just already taught them what the different symptoms will be. So you might get inaccurate information in that survey. So those are some things to consider as you put this survey together. So another element as you're writing questions in the survey is that, well, first off, I should just say, when we're writing a survey, it's a good idea for very important variables to try and see if you can find a validated scale where somebody spent a lot of time, where people have studied these concepts and these questions using a very well-designed survey, and you basically use their questions because it's well studied and it's sort of accepted within the field, right? So very often you want to use these validated scales or questions. That being said, sometimes you can't find a validated scale to ask a question that you're addressing, or maybe they're just too long and you need to have something fairly quick. So it's very common in studies that you'll have to actually create some of your own questions. So if you're going to do that, how do you do it well? All right. Well, there's a lot of mistakes that people can make in writing survey questions, and we've all seen them because we've all filled out lots of surveys and we've looked at these questions and we said, what are you asking, right? What is going on here? Or this doesn't make any sense, or I could answer this 3 different ways and you don't even give me the options I need, right? So there's a few problems here. So one is ambiguous questions. So this is when you're asking a question where the question or the words used could mean a lot of different things, all right? If I were to ask, what does nursing mean to you? Am I asking you, what is the definition of nursing? Am I asking you sort of philosophically, what does nursing mean in a global sense? Or am I asking you personally, how do you feel about nursing? I don't know. I mean, what does that question mean? That would be an example of an ambiguous question. Another possibility is a leading question. So if I ask you something like, why is Professor Wade such an excellent teacher, right? Well, that question is kind of implying that I am an excellent teacher, right? It's kind of saying the assumption in the question itself is that I'm an excellent teacher. Well, maybe I'm a miserable teacher, right? By phrasing things in certain ways, you can bias your participants towards answering the question in certain ways. Another possibility is a double-barreled question, and this is when there's actually more than one question asked at the same time. So if I were to ask you, are you a registered nurse and do you have a DNP, right? Well, those are actually 2 different questions, right? You should probably ask those questions separately, right? Because you could be a registered nurse and not have a DNP. So if you say no, you can't say no to that question if you're a registered nurse and you don't have a DNP, right? So it puts together 2 questions in the same question, and that's pretty common. Another problem is double negatives. So this is when you're asking a question that's complex and you're asking people to agree or disagree with a negative statement, all right? So this becomes kind of hard conceptually. So I'll give you an example. So do you disagree that reading research isn't hard? Yes or no? So you think about that. Do I disagree that reading research isn't hard? No or yes, right? It becomes very hard cognitively to figure out what's being asked in that question. And this is a very common type of question type that can throw people off, right? Another type of question is a loaded question, or using loaded words or concepts, all right? So some nurses, so if I ask a question like, some nurses feel like calling a code makes them a failure as a nurse, right? How often have you called a code, right? So if in your question you're saying you're implying that someone might feel or is a failure as a nurse if they do something, and then you ask them how often they do that thing, well, you've loaded it. You've made it sort of emotionally tense, right? And when you do that, people are less likely to feel comfortable answering that question. They can really bias their responses, right? So this is some examples of the types of challenge you have as you're writing a survey to write a survey that can get you more accurate information. So I'm going to give you some examples of questions where there's problems. So what I would suggest is I'll ask the question, pause it, and then think about what your response is, and then I'm going to give you an answer, all right? You might want to pause the video in between and try not to look ahead too far. Okay, so here's a question. How often have you sought care and received treatment for your condition? So what might be the problem with this question? So for this question, I would argue that it's both ambiguous and double-barreled. So here you're asking about a condition. A condition is not very clear. What does that actually mean? You also aren't clear about what type of medical professional you're talking about here, right? And it's also double-barreled in the sense that you could seek care, but you might not actually get treatment, right? So here's an alternate. So you could say, this survey asks about your visits to licensed medical professionals and the treatments that are provided. How many times have you visited a licensed clinician to receive care for your diabetes over the past year? All right. So that also puts a constraint in terms of the timing, right? And then how many times has a licensed clinician written you a prescription to help you manage your diabetes, right? So that might be a better way of getting more accurate information for this question. All right. So another question might be, to what extent do you disagree that your licensed healthcare professional has failed to provide high quality care? Right? What might be a problem with this question? You can pause it. All right. I would argue that it's both leading and a double negative. All right. So there's an element of failed to provide high quality care that is somewhat leading there, right? So it seems like there might be some bias in that question. I also would say that it's also a double negative, right? So you're asking someone to disagree with whether or not someone has failed to provide care, or how much you disagree, right? So another example to this, or an alternate way of asking this question is, what do you think about the quality of care that you have received from your licensed healthcare provider in the past year, right? So it comes across as more neutral, and you're saying, you know, from very poor up to excellent, right? For example. So less potential for bias in this question. All right, here's another example. So as a parent, you are legally responsible for ensuring that your children are not seriously harmed. Which of the following preventative actions have you done? So what do you think about that question? Well, I'd argue that that's both loaded and leading, right? So when you're saying to somebody, you know, not only are you a bad parent, but it's illegal if you don't take care of your kid, and then you ask them how often they've done certain things that prevent them risk for their child. Well, it's loaded because emotionally speaking, as a parent, you know, you really want to be a good parent. And it's also leading because it implies that you should be answering a certain way, right? So another way of responding to this, of asking this question might be, which of the following list of actions have you done with your child over the past year? And you might get a much better response there because the participant isn't sort of pushed to answer in a certain way. All right. So when you're thinking about this, you would go through a process of writing these questions, putting them together, doing the best you can to create this. And then you would actually go and test out your questionnaire, your survey with participants. So here you typically find a group of people who are pretty similar to the people that you want to respond to your survey, and ask them to fill out the survey. And then you ask them questions about, first off, you look at how they respond to it and see if there seems to be any bias in the responses. And you also might ask them questions about whether or not the different questions were easy for them to respond. Did they make sense to them? Were there other ways that they would suggest responding to that survey? You know, the other thing that you can do that's helpful here is to actually ask an expert in the different areas, and ask your colleagues, for example, what do they think of the survey in terms of how well it measures what you're trying to look at. So that's another thing to consider as you're developing these surveys. Something I would also say is that sometimes these pilot studies can actually be published as research. They're usually not seen as being strong sources, but they sometimes are useful for getting some initial information about a particular question. All right, so this is just some information about how you design surveys or questionnaires. I hope that it's helpful for thinking about some of the different processes that researchers go through in terms of developing this. I also hope that as you go forward in your career, that maybe if you decide to eventually create a survey, that this will be useful for you in terms of helping you think about how to effectively get good information about the questions that you have. So thank you all very much for listening, and I hope you're well, and take care, everyone.